Welcome to the Investing in Inclusion interview series, where we are exploring the theme of what it means for business leaders and their organizations to move beyond merely pledging a commitment to diversity, to investing concretely in the policies, practices, and resources that create truly inclusive environments. These leaders advance principles of DEI, not just within their companies, but also in the communities in which they operate. We're so fortunate today to have Shun Lim from Russell Reynolds. I'm so excited that our audience is going to be able to learn from you and gain from your experience and insights. Thank you so much for being with us today. Now, I'd like to share a little bit more about your background. Before joining Russell Reynolds, Shun was the Global Diversity and Inclusion Manager at Givaudan, establishing their DEI strategy, plans, and operating frameworks to enable strategic growth. Before that, she worked in a range of global organizations, including Shell and Microsoft. Her career has spanned operations, branding, business transformation, and change management, which has enhanced a rich and multi-layered perspective in her advising. Welcome again, Shun. It's such a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm really glad to be here today with you.
So, Shun, you've been such a wonderful resource to so many of us here in the region. And I think one of the first questions that we have tackled, and that is we guide business leaders who want to build strong DEI frameworks in their organizations is, what does it mean to have diversity, equity, and inclusion resources in Asia? So in other words, what does diversity mean in the Asian context?
So for business leaders in Asia thinking about their DE&I strategy, it's really important to, first of all, acknowledge and recognize the richness of the diversity in Asia itself. Asia has so many different languages, cultures, ethnicity, religions in the region itself that so often is overlooked and untapped. We also have to recognize the different challenges that are unique to the region. For example, the amount of inter-country migration that happens. So migrations, migrant workers, international expatriation, all of that brings a certain richness to Asia Pacific that is much more of a threat than in other parts of the world. So that's one of the things to recognize. There are other things around infrastructure. For example, the sizes of homes, the fact that there are so many megacities in Asia that we also do need to consider when we think about diversity and inclusion and the policies that we need to have in order to ensure that there is really a richness and a consideration of that diversity in the workplace.
Shun, that is so right. It is such a dynamic region that we have the privilege of living and working in. And any DEI strategy has to be just as dynamic. But have you seen some companies who, in all good faith, are trying to craft their DEI strategy in the region, make mistakes? And what are one or two of the most common mistakes or pitfalls that business leaders who are crafting an Asia-specific strategy should avoid?
So leaders often craft strategies from their vantage point, and it's always well-intentioned. But we have to recognize that it comes from their own perspective and lenses of the world. So one of the things I try to remind leaders about is that there is a difference physically as well as mentally. Using a book that I would encourage people to look at, this book called Geography of Thought by Richard Nisbett, talks about how thought has evolved over time in the East and in the West. In the West, for example, a lot of the way that we think is shaped by very Aristotelian philosophies. In the East, definitely a large swath of Asia Pacific is shaped by Confucius thinking as well as more collectivistic views. So that's one thing that we have to recognize. And so when we think about diversity, there's a lot of, in the Western lens first, celebration of differences. So differences are celebrated, differences are enhanced. But in Asia, differences are accepted. And there is a difference in that nuance of that approach. So it's not about shouting loudly about the differences, for example. The second thing I would say is because of that infrastructure difference between Asia and the West, oftentimes when we think about policies, we are very mistaken in our approach to diversity. If I use the pandemic as an example, working from home was probably an easier option for many people in the West because just of the size of the homes that they typically have, versus in Asia where many workers live in the megacities itself, so small apartments. And so being able to work from home still meant that you couldn't actually have a room where you could have your teleconferences, your virtual meetings. People were interrupting the meetings as a result of that. When even before the pandemic, sometimes Western managers would be wondering why are their employees taking a call at 10 p.m. at night because of the time zone in the office. And it was because of infrastructure such as this. And so there's a lot of misperceptions about what work-life balance means, what inclusion means in Asia versus in the West. And that's often because of how managers have seen this through a Western lens, interpreted Asian activities, Asian behaviors through that Western lens. And we need to, first of all, be very aware of that in therefore crafting anything to come out to Asia. Look at what's happening here and understand that more deeply. What are the reasons for the behaviors that we have seen from an Asian lens?
That is really helpful. And part of our goal is to understand the framework, and you've presented it in a way that is so helpful in thinking about what does inclusion and diversity mean in the region, what elements go into it. And as business leaders now start to think about their commitment to diversity and how to move towards implementation, one step we've seen a number of companies take in the last 4 or 5 years is to appoint a head of DEI. But in doing so, there are a number of things that they need to think about. And you and I have had conversations in the past where you've really put forth a really clarifying framework in terms of how you should think about looking for the right head of DEI to match your organization. Could you share some of those reflections with our audience today?
Yeah, sure. So with regards to looking for heads of DE&I, the demand for chief diversity officers for global heads of diversity, for regional heads of diversity has truly exploded in the last 3 or 4 years, as we have seen, due to the pandemic, due to George Floyd, due to Black Lives Matter, so on and so forth. I was really taken aback by that explosion, actually, and the demand. Unfortunately, so on the one side, we do see it as a gift, right? That organizations are beginning to realize the importance of this role. But unfortunately, I also feel that there could be a backlash with the way that companies have jumped onto the diversity bandwagon and say we now need a chief diversity officer, and just going out to grab one. The fact is, no matter how much of an urgency there is in the situation, it's always important to take time, to take stock first and foremost. So for companies rushing in, I would say pause. Think about where you are currently on your DE&I journey. Are you only at the beginning? Is this about starting up a strategy? Are you somewhere in the middle? And because of the demand, your chief diversity officer has actually taken on a bigger opportunity somewhere else, leaving behind a strategy that is half-formed, well-formed, and just needs to be sustained. So all of this is very important. Also, the maturity of your D&I strategy, because for some organizations, before this, DEI was about gender, or maybe it was about race and gender. And for others, they have built a stronger foundation and are now looking to deepen that into other dimensions of diversity or into new areas. For example, in terms of, say, supplier diversity or product innovation as an example. So all of these different considerations are really important in then shaping your thinking about the requirements of the chief diversity officer or the head of DE&I that you require. And on the flip side, therefore, from a talent perspective, there are many, many heads of DE&I today, but each of them bring unique strengths Each of them brings unique capabilities, and each of them also brings unique motivations to the work. Some thrive as startups, DEI officers, great at coming into an organization and helping to kickstart the DE&I work. Others are better at sustaining something that's been built as well as scaling it. So we have to recognize what you need and then look for the talent that actually fulfills that. Sometimes then with startup DEI officers, if I can call them that, it also means that if they come in and they help you to bring your organization from zero DEI to and making that come alive off of a piece of white paper, you have to recognize that they bring a lot of energy into that space, but they are not so great with then continuing to scale. And oftentimes then recognizing that therefore we're not necessarily hiring a head of diversity that will last for 10 years, but that if this is somebody who will do this for maybe 3 to 5 years, get it off on a good foundation, and then be looking out for their next challenge, and then finding somebody else to take that to the next level. Those are the sorts of thinking that we need to start to have when we think about looking for a DEI officer and setting up your DEI office.
Shun, that is such important advice. You know, when organizations look for leaders outside of the DEI space, they think so much about fit, cultural fit in terms of competencies that people bring. And I think you and I have observed that with the heads of DEI, that's not always a consideration. They're just so relieved to have someone come in and lead the strategy that they don't think about it in this very clear and methodical way that you've laid out. So I'm just thrilled that you've been able to share that. And speaking about learnings, you also have shared that you made a shift in your professional journey. You were in-house and in a way serving as an internal consultant to companies as they were building their DEI strategy. And then you were motivated and inspired to move to Russell Reynolds and be an external consultant so you could share some of the lessons that you learned in-house. So may I ask you, what are 2 or 3 of those key lessons and that you hope to impart to your clients now?
So one of the lessons is this point about matching where an organization is on its DEI journey with the consultant that they need to bring in, right, to start up DE&I in their organization. I was finding that, you know, recruitment agencies were calling me up, right? Recruiters from companies were calling me up about DE&I, and oftentimes I ask them, what is your company, why do you want to hire a DE&I officer, where are you? And I'm finding that I'm drawing blanks. There is a position specification that tells what's the requirements, but they haven't really mapped it. And so it was really frustrating, call after call that you were getting, and I said, okay, I need to interrupt this and take a step out. And at the same time, I was also seeing that many successful DEI heads were being asked to consider these roles, right? And many of them, of course, were being sought out because of their success. But coming then into an organization without asking the right questions do set them up for failure. It sets up the D&I officer for failure. It sets up the company that's hiring them in for failure when there's so many little things that can be done. So 2 of the little things I would say is very often I hear companies saying, we want a chief diversity officer and we want somebody who's passionate about DE&I. Well, that's great, but passion is not a substitute for budget. It's not a substitute for significant investment. And so one of the mistakes I found is that companies tend to underinvest both in the role as well as in the office itself in terms of how much they are prepared to spend on program. That is a serious miss because the risk of getting it wrong has huge implications for the company with its employees, with its reputation, with future talent. So we really do need to, first and foremost, advise companies that if you want to hire a chief diversity officer, it's not just looking for a passionate person. You have to stand a significant commitment around resourcing of a team, of a budget behind that person. I think that's the first lesson. The second thing is many organizations tend to then say, well, we've got our chief diversity officer now. This person or this one person or this small tiny office is supposed to make magic happen for the entire organization, and that's putting a lot on a small group of people. So even as they look for their chief diversity officer or have their chief diversity officer, it's important that the leaders of the organization understand and recognize that leaders actually need to play a key role. A successful DE&I strategy requires investment of senior leader commitment toned from the top, as well as broad organizational alignment behind it. And that doesn't just come from the office, it comes from the role of leaders, making sure that that happens as well.
These are incredibly important lessons. And I think we've been focusing on the building blocks, the basics for what is necessary to have a recipe for success for an organization to build out their DEI strategy. To make things a bit more concrete for our audience members and our business leaders, I'm hoping that you can help us go through a mini case study of sorts, right? And to think about a particular challenge, a way in which you faced resistance or non-inclusive habits were really entrenched in an organization. Can you describe what that challenge was and how you tackled it, how you went about trying to address this, this problem?
So oftentimes we think about DEI challenges as things like macro harassment, uninclusive managers, and there's a lot that is already being advised around addressing this. I'd like to take it a little bit deeper and talk about two things that we typically miss. One is the fear of leaders today to talk about D&I. There's this almost paralyzing fear that says, I'm so scared to talk about it, damn if I do, damn if I don't. So let's talk about that one. But the second thing I'll talk about is also that many times there are a lot of well-intentioned efforts, but somehow it seems like emphasizing diversity has led to a lot of exclusionary practices. And we'll tackle both. So the fear of the leader first is something that I've really picked up over the last few years. When I first started on my D&I journey as a practitioner, I didn't pick this up as much. Leaders were more coming from a place of, I'm not aware of what to say, but if you tell me, I'm happy to go out and do that. Today, if you talk to leaders, it's more really out of a sense of fear. That even if they were saying, I'm not aware and you tell me, but after you've told me, I'm still worried about what I should do and how I should behave. It feels like they're stepping on eggshells. And that's partly a function of how much there has been this social media feed, and the whole cancel culture has kind of swung in certain ways that leaders find it so hard to recover from a misstep. So I think that's one thing that is really challenging for organizations. I've tried to talk to leaders about this and say, let's think about it from the perspective of diversity is messy. It's never going to be easy. There's never a perfect solution. This is about growing into it. And it means that you have to give yourself grace if you've tried. And you've also got to ask for grace from others if you have tried. So it's that vulnerability. But vulnerability is really hard for leaders as an exercise. But you have to grow into that, and that's about the future of leadership competence, if I can talk about that a little bit later. The second thing I would say, which is that other point about how it's interesting that as we try to emphasize diversity, I've realized that many organizations unintentionally begin to push an almost exclusionary approach to DE&I that we have to be careful with. So what I mean by that is, for example, when we first started talking about gender diversity, when we first started talking about race and ethnic diversity, it's all well and good, and then you're highlighting that difference. It becomes an us versus them situation. And then we have women's development programs, we have had Hispanic development programs, right? African American, Black leadership development programs. And all of this, again, well and good. But the problem we then have is that overemphasis on the difference has sometimes led to a feeling of disenfranchisement from the majority in other cases. So it could be the majority as in white men, but it could also be white women, right, who are then feeling exclusionary when you think about, say, a Black leadership program. Now, I'm not against the dimensions, or I'm not against the focus on dimensions, but there has to be a better way to manage this tension, right, between exclusion and inclusion, focusing on the differences, and yet also bringing everybody into that equation. And in trying to address this, I've started to really talk about how we can be inclusively diverse. And inclusively diverse means, yes, we recognize the inequity that has been there, and yet in addressing and in designing solutions to address that inequity, can we think about how that solution could be embracive of everyone? If I could just be indulged with just one example to highlight, we talk about parental leave. And for women, that's important, definitely, in taking care of children. And then we say, let's emphasize and increase the possibility for men to take that parental leave as well. But men don't take that today still in the numbers that we would like to see, because we've always had that stereotype in our heads still. You've changed the word from, say, maternity leave to parental leave, but it is still the stereotype is still in people's heads. And so there is a double bind for men in this case who want to take that parental leave, where they could be interpreted as being non-committal. So when we design something like that, but we don't talk therefore about it from a broader frame of giving people that space, so that it's not just women, but it's also men, you end up with very ineffective policies, and you still have that division that's happening. So it's really important for us to think about how everything we design, even if it's to support somebody who has had an inequitable an experience, how that can still be elevated to a more inclusive experience for all.
These are really big, impactful themes, right? And they can seem daunting for those who are at different stages of the journey to think about it, but you've pinpointed the heart of what needs to happen to really root out the practices and policies that are preventing inclusive environments. And you're right, with all good intentions, a lot of the times the very policies that are put in place to try to foster inclusivity unintentionally end up being exclusive. So these are, I feel like just in this one answer, you've given us so much of what people spend years trying to figure out in building DEI programs. And in thinking about that, as you have done this work, you yourself have evolved. Looking back, is there an approach that you would have adjusted, or a different road that you would have taken in building out your DEI practice?
So it's an interesting evolution, right? Definitely when I first started, I was looking at DE&I very much on the differences. I went along with everybody else in thinking about this. I was actually a woman leader in the business and asked to help out with DE&I, and we started the Women's Network. We had gender differences dialogues at work. And on hindsight, right, now the wiser me now will probably have said that was the wrong side of the problem to be starting at. So I remember running these workshops where we were talking about the differences between women and men as leaders, right? Women as more nurturing, men as more, say, ambitious and aggressive leaders, and so on and so forth, and trying to help at that point, men who are leaders to understand these differences in therefore promoting more women at work. So that's all well and good, but I was also realizing that solidified the stereotypes that were in people's heads. Today I talk about the fact that there is no male or female leadership traits. They are just great leadership traits. So if we say that there are a set of leadership traits, they should be gender agnostic. What are the leadership traits we need for the future? And how do we nurture both the men and the women to get to those leadership traits, so that we are just changing the way that the world is led, gender agnostically. So that's one of the things I would say I would give advice to my younger self on, to say less emphasis on the differences, but how do you elevate this beyond stereotypes?
And Shun, you're in such good company there, because the whole field has shifted around this, and the way that we think about gender and the way that we think about traditional notions in this way. So you've learned, I've learned, and the goal is that, organizations also are able to evolve as these concepts change too. And I would love to ask you on that theme of giving advice. We always want to bring it back to our NCEOD students. They're the very heart of our community in many ways. And as you think about what your clients who span sectors, the leaders in industries that our students want to join, what should they be thinking about as they begin their MBA journeys? What sort of qualifications, what sort of competencies should they be looking to acquire in order to be the type of inclusive leaders that companies want today?
So, to the future leaders of tomorrow, one of the things I would emphasize is how do you drive yourself to be an inclusive leader? Inclusion is a muscle that we have to actually exercise intentionally and consciously. Oftentimes I tell leaders, if you do not intentionally practice inclusion, you will unintentionally exclude somebody. With the best of intentions, you will still do that. So we need to be able to practice inclusion actively as a muscle. And the more you exercise that muscle, the better you get at it. So that's the one thing I would say. And it ties back to the notion of allyship as well. And that is an important skill set for leaders to have going forward, because there is an interpersonal aspect of allyship that many people are aware of today, but I will also say there's an intrapersonal piece. So the interpersonal piece is usually how are you an ally to other people? How are you nurturing other people and coaching other people and giving feedback to others? There's a lot of literature and emphasis on all of that. How do you how do you intervene? How do you speak up for others? But there's also an intrapersonal aspect to allyship that we've not really been working on or talking so much about. So the vulnerability, the authenticity, being aware of what you are not aware of, being aware of your own privilege that may be preventing you from seeing what's happening to someone else. That aspect also needs to be exercised if we really want to be intentional. So that would be both aspects, both muscles need to be exercised, I would say, and that would be the advice I would give. So practice inclusive leadership by being both an ally to yourself as well as being an ally to others.
That is excellent advice. And INSEAD is an incredible laboratory for students to be able to do that, because they are encountering such difference and such diversity and such multiplicity of perspectives every day. And so they have plenty of opportunity to practice that excellent advice. Shun, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for your advice. Thank you for generously giving your time. But most of all, thank you for being such a guiding light to many of us who focus on DEI work in the region. It's really been a pleasure, and I'm so grateful to be mentored by you as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sharon. I really enjoyed this as well, so thank you so much for having me today.